Good afternoon, all, and thank you for joining us in our 2024 complimentary webinar series covering the FAR, or Federal Acquisition Regulations. We're coming to you live today from Washington, D.C. Thank you for being here. So a little bit about the series. As usual, all of our webinars are complimentary and recorded. The FAR has 52 total parts, and we're going to run through them sequentially each week on Wednesdays and Fridays at noon Eastern Time. The recordings and the PowerPoints will be posted within 24 hours of the webinar ending, and you can find the recordings on our YouTube channel simply by subscribing to it using the link you see on the screen, and there's no cost for this. You can also find the PowerPoint on the slide share using your LinkedIn credentials to log in, and there's no cost to this either. We also offer sponsorship opportunities, so if that's something you're interested in, please send us an email to hello@jenniferschaus.com. And now how to sign up for the series. Unfortunately, there isn't a bulk registration, so you do have to register individually for each webinar, but if you go to the Jennifer Schaus website, navigate to the section called the FAR, you'll find the individual registration links, and also the recording links are going to be posted there upon the completion of each webinar. Please note that we covered the FAR in 2020, so if you're eager to get a jump start, please find these historical recordings on our site. If you navigate to the Webinars tab and scroll down to section the FAR 2020, but just because it has been 4 years, many of the regulations have changed and been updated, so please use this as a reference tool only. So just a little bit about us. We work with established federal contractors worldwide, helping them to navigate the market, and our services range from market analysis reports to contract vehicles and compliance. And some of the contract vehicles we support are listed here on your screen. For more information, you can visit our website, and those were our services for federal contractors. But we also provide marketing and advertising services for organizations who are selling to federal contractors. We can add extra muscle to your marketing efforts via our newsletter ads and webinar sponsorships and in-person events. Please email us and ask for our media kit. We're currently offering a spring special with discounted rates, more specifically a buy one, get one for our newsletter. These ads will run for 13 weeks starting from May 6th, so please email us if you have any questions or if you want to quote. As you know, congressional hearings on both the House of Representatives and on the Senate side are open to the public unless otherwise stated. So we have a list here of the hearings, including the date, time, buildings, and room numbers. Most meetings take place in the Dirksen, Rayburn, or Cannon building, and next week meetings are primarily around budget requests. So if you're selling to any of these departments or agencies, attending the hearings can be a great way to gather information, understand the process, and also network with influencers. Coming up in June, we'll hear from Carrie Palmatier on small business innovations in federal contracting. Specifically, Carrie will cover information on SBIRs and STTRs. These two options are a great way for tech companies to grow in the federal sector, and this is a two-part series, but as always, these are recorded and complimentary. Our webinars are completely complimentary thanks to our longtime and generous corporate sponsors and in-kind sponsors, so please allow me a second to introduce them. We would like to thank our friends over at GovEvents, the premier platform for posting events related to government and government contracting. You can find all of our events on our webinars on govevents.com, as well as the recordings from our past 600+ webinars. We also want to thank Tom Johnson and his team at Set Aside Alert, the go-to publication for contracting opportunities for small, women-owned, veteran-owned, HubZone, and 8A firms. Visit setasidealert.com for more information. The Fairfax Economic Development Authority has an online calendar of events and webinars, and we want to thank them for posting our events and webinars on their calendar. The Virginia Apex Accelerator at George Mason University offers free one-on-one counseling to established government contracting firms in Virginia on federal, state, and local procurement topics. If you're interested in learning more, please use the links provided to explore their services, review homework recommendations, register for live trainings, and find other useful links to agencies and other self-directed learnings. One-on-one counseling is limited to eligible client companies, and appointment requests are handled in the order they were received and based on counselor availability due to high demand. Online resources and group trainings are free with no restriction on business location. Join the Greater Reston Chamber of Commerce's monthly GovCon Council meeting to network with peers, learn about upcoming events and opportunities, and help to shape future programming. The meetings take place on the 4th Tuesday of each month at 8:30 at the Greater Reston Chamber of Commerce. So the next meeting is going to be actually next Tuesday on April 23rd from 8:30 to 9:30 a.m. The Greater Reston Chamber of Commerce is going to be hosting its 12th annual NOVA B2G Conference and Small Business Expo on May 2nd in Reston, Virginia. The event includes networking, matchmaking, breakout sessions, an expo hall, and keynotes from the government and industry. Attendees can schedule one-to-one matchmaking meetings with primes and agencies, and also visit the expo showcasing services to help GovCon succeed. Education sessions will cover the full life cycle of government contracting from proposal creation to compliance. Please visit novab2g.restonchamber.org for more information. Do you want help winning government contracts? BidSpeed can help. Users can find contract opportunities from federal, state, and local governments. Additionally, you can search for teaming partners, incumbent point of contact, expiring contracts, compliance matrices, and also proposal templates. Create your login at bidspeed.com today. BidSpeed is an official partner of the U.S. Small Business Administration's E2G Empower to Grow program. Events are the ultimate engagement channel to bring government and industry together. 68% of government personnel report that they attend more than one event each year. The Federal Business Council, or FBC, has worked with government and industry for 45 plus years to create gatherings where ideas are shared and to help government achieve its goals. This includes agency industry days, cybersecurity symposiums, technology expos, and offsite meetings. FBC provides full lifecycle meeting planning and event management. With over 5,000 meetings under their belt, FBC has the experience, systems, and personnel to make your next event exceptional. Learn more at www.fbcinc.com. Please check out our friends over at GovBrew. GovBrew is the most read GovCon newsletter, keeping thousands of GovCon professionals in the loop with news, updates, and opportunities in the federal contracting market, all in a fun and accessible email that only takes 5 minutes to read. It's 100% free to join, and it goes out every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 7 a.m. It's filled with great content, event postings, webinars, and more. We encourage you to sign up at govbrew.co, or you can use the QR code you see on the screen. Okay, now let's meet today's speaker. Please welcome Sandy Levy to the webinar. We're honored to have you here with us today, Sandy, and we're so excited to hear your presentation on the FAR. We appreciate the time you took to put together the content, and now I'm going to put myself on mute and turn the floor over to you. Please let me know when you're ready for your next slide, and I'll advance them just as we discussed.
Awesome. Thank you, Sophia. Welcome, everyone. Appreciate you joining today to talk about other socioeconomic programs. An important part of the FAR Part 26. Like I was introduced, I'm Sandy Levy. I am with an organization called WestEd. WestEd's a nonprofit organization providing educational support and solutions to local, state, and federal government educational resources. Next slide. So today we're going to go through the entire FAR Part 26. And within this FAR Part 26, there's a few sections, a few subparts. The first subpart is the Indian Incentive Program. The second is the Major Disaster Emergency Assistance Activities. The third is the Historically Black Colleges and Universities and Minority Institutions, also known as HBCU/MI. And then finally, the food donations to nonprofit organizations. Next slide. So the purpose of the other socioeconomic program, and the reason why this FAR came to play, is to provide opportunity for certain businesses who qualify as socioeconomically disadvantaged businesses. Per the SBA, a socioeconomically disadvantaged business meets the following criteria. 1, the firm must be 51% or more owned and controlled. I underscored that for a reason, by one or more disadvantaged persons. The disadvantaged persons or persons must be socially disadvantaged and economically disadvantaged, and we'll talk further in another slide about what that means. And the firm must be small in accordance to SBA size standards. And the SBA size standards are typically tied to the NAICS size standards codes, which is the North American Industry Classification Systems. And I've provided a link for you there to refer to later. And going back to the owned and controlled, the reason why I've underscored that is 51%. It has to be not just 51% owned, but that owner has a control and a say over the actual business and the function of the business. Next slide. So who are socioeconomically disadvantaged parties? Socioeconomically disadvantaged parties include groups who have been systemically over time subject to racial or ethnic prejudice or cultural bias within the larger American cultures. This includes certain groupings such as African Americans, Asian Pacific Americans like people from Hawaii, Hispanic Americans, Native Americans, which include Alaska Native Americans, as well as what they call the lower 48 Native Americans, and subcontinent Asian Americans, and then finally, members of other groups that may qualify if they can satisfactorily demonstrate they meet an established criteria. And I provided a link all throughout these slides. You're going to see I'm providing a link to more information about the subject of the particular slide. Next slide. So let's talk a bit about the Indian Incentive Program. FAR Part 26.1 is comprised of primarily 4 sections, although you see 5 references here. But the 4 primary sections include, and this is a common theme within all of these FAR references, a scope of a subpart, definitions, policy, and there's a policy around the program itself, and procedures in executing the actual program. And then finally, the contract clause, which is directions for the contracting officers of when to possibly include this particular FAR or a reference of the FAR in the contract. Next slide. So the scope of the subpart for the Indian Incentive Program, which I'm going to start referring to as IIP. So section 26.100, this implements the code. So this program has been codified in the US Code under 25 USC 1544, which provides an incentive to prime contractors that use Indian organizations and Indian-owned economic enterprises as subcontractors. And we'll talk a bit more about what that incentive means and how it needs to be applied. It must be funded, for example, but we'll talk a bit more about that in a later slide. Next slide. All right, so I've provided you all the definitions. I won't read through all of them, but I'll highlight a few of them for you. An Indian organization, for example, means a governing body of an Indian tribe or entity established or recognized by the governing body of an Indian tribe for the purposes of the code of 25 USC chapter 17. Again, all of these definitions are codified in the US Code. An Indian means any person who is a member of any Indian tribe, band, group, pueblo, or community that is recognized by the federal government as eligible for services from the Bureau of Indian Affairs, which is part of the Department of Interior, in accordance with 25 USC 1452C, and any native as defined in the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act, which I provide a reference for you there as well. And then Indian-owned economic enterprises means any Indian-owned, as determined by the Secretary of Interior, which again, BIA is part of, commercial, industrial, or business activity established or organized for the purpose of profit, provided that Indian ownership constitutes not less than 51% of the enterprise. And remember, we talked in the beginning about 51% owned and controlled. That means the Indian owned must be 51% owned and controlled as well. And then just a list of some of the tribes that's defined here. It includes native villages and native groups, including corporations organized by Kenai, Juneau, Sitka, and Kodiak, as defined in the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act, that is recognized by the federal government as eligible for services from BIA. Okay, next slide. All right, so here's the policy around IIP. So Indian organizations and Indian-owned economic enterprises shall have the maximum practicable opportunity to participate in performing contracts awarded by federal agencies. And to fulfill this requirement, the IIP allows an incentive. Here's the incentive I was talking about. Incentive payment equal to 5% of the amount paid to a subcontractor in performing the contract, if the contract so authorizes and the subcontractor is an Indian organization or Indian-owned economic enterprise. So what this means is that if a prime contractor elects to award a subcontract to an Indian-owned economic enterprise, Indian-owned company, they could, in fact, if it's stated in the contract, it's important for those of you who are prime contractors to ensure it's in your contract from the government, that you are able to obtain a 5% incentive for awarding subcontracts to an Indian organization or Indian-owned economic enterprise. So if that is the case and you say, for example, award a subcontract to an Indian organization, Indian-owned economic enterprise for say $500,000, you could in turn receive a $25,000 incentive for doing so from the government, provided again it's stated in your contract, and two, that there's funding allowing for that incentive. So it's important to keep that in mind. And of course, as you're forming your teams and you're taking into consideration working with an Indian organization or Indian-owned economic enterprise, those are some of the things that you want to be aware of as you're starting to put your proposal together and work with the government on the solicitation. Next slide. So here are the procedures under the IIP. So a contracting officer and prime contractor acting in good faith may rely on the representation of an Indian organization or Indian-owned economic enterprise as to its eligibility, unless an interested party challenges its status or the contracting officer has independent reason to question that status. So what this means essentially is that if you're a prime contractor, you can rely on the certification of an organization that they're Indian organization or Indian-owned economic enterprise, that they are in fact that. And you can do, you have them fill out a reps and certifications, if you will, and they check the box that they are. And you'll also want to make sure that you do your due diligence, that you go out to sam.gov and you verify and validate that they are classified as that in sam.gov as well. That's just sort of a checks and balances that you can keep in your file should it ever be audited or questioned. And in this way, unless there's a challenge to that, and if there is a challenge to that, there's a procedure that we'll talk about later, what happens if that gets challenged. But that's really kind of all you have to do to rely on that statement. So the second part of this procedure is, provided who, along with the address, that raises that challenge on the status, and they have to send it into the BIA essentially to address the challenge, and then the BIA then does their own investigation. But the key word here to submit a challenge is that it has to be timely, and a timely challenge I've outlined here. From the FAR, it's a challenge that's one, in writing, two, it identifies the basis for the challenge, three, it provides detailed evidence supporting the claim. So there has to be evidentiary support to such claim. Can't just say they're just not because we said so. You have to show it. And four, it has to be filed and received by the contracting officer prior to the award of the subcontract. And this is key when teams are being formed, that if someone is going to present a challenge, then they have to know in advance that, and usually you do, what teams are being formed. But if they're going to challenge something like this, they have to do so before that subcontract is awarded, because prior to that, it's no longer timely. The time has passed. The BIA is probably going to deny the challenge. Next slide. Okay, so more on the procedures. This talks about what the BIA does. If the BIA determination is not received within the prescribed time period, the contracting officer and the prime contractor may again rely on the representation of the subcontractor. So again, that self-certification, they can rely upon it. And then subject to the terms and conditions of the contract and the availability of the funds, as I had mentioned, contracting officers shall also authorize an incentive payment of 5% of the amount paid to the subcontractor. And contracting officers shall seek funding in accordance with agency procedures. So this last bullet point F is where it's really important to make sure that if you're going to use an Indian organization or Indian economic organization, that you are making sure that when it's in your contract that you're going to get this incentive, and two, that the funding is there and it shows up, that incentive. It can be on a line item, it could be a CLIN, it could be a SLIN, it could be put into your contract that incentive is going to be paid to you. Okay, next slide. All right, and so finally, this part of the IIP is the contract clause, and you'll see this type of clause in many FAR clauses. Essentially, it says that contracting officers and civilian agencies may insert the utilization of Indian organizations and Indian-owned economic enterprise in a solicitation and contracts if, in the opinion of the contracting officer, subcontracting possibilities exist for the Indian organization or Indian-owned economic enterprise, and two, that funds are available for any increased costs as described in paragraph B2 of the clause. Okay, next slide. All right, let's talk about some major disaster or emergency assistance activities under subpart 26.2. This subpart really refers to support in the event of an emergency, a major disaster, a hurricane, a tornado. 'Tis the season for these things. We're coming up to this time of year where tornadoes come through and destroy entire neighborhoods and cities, hurricanes as well, major fires, things of that nature. So this FAR clause kind of talks to what to do when we're going in to support remediation and helping those areas. So like so many other FAR clauses in the subparts, this one is also the same, and having a scope, having definitions. Two things that are unique here are local area preference, and we'll talk about more what that means, evaluation preference, transition of work, justification for expenditures for other than local firms, and that ties back up to the local area preference, the disaster response registry, and I'll talk a bit more about what that means, and then the solicitation provision and contract clauses. Next slide. Okay, so the scope of subpart. So this subpart implements what's called the Robert T. Stafford Disaster Relief and Emergency Assistance Act, and that again is codified under 42 USC 5150. And this provides a preference for local organizations, firms, and individuals when contracting for major disasters or emergency assistance activities. So the government is encouraged to use local organizations when responding to a major disaster or emergency assistance activity. The Robert T., and I've given you what that means here with a reference, the Robert T. Stafford Disaster Relief and Emergency Act constitutes as the statutory authority for most federal disaster response activities, especially as they pertain to FEMA and FEMA programs. Next slide. So here's some definitions for you, and I won't read them for you. I'll let you do that on your own time. But essentially, the local firm, and I wanted to point this out, means a private organization or firm or individual residing or doing business primarily in that major disaster and emergency area. And this is, when we talk about local firms, the reason why we're leaning towards them is that, they know the area best. They know the resources best, typically. And this is why the government is encouraged to engage with local firms first and foremost. I mean, if it isn't available, then the government can go outside of the local firm. But that being said, the first line of response is to go to a local firm. And then what a major disaster emergency area means, it's included in the official presidential declaration. So we've heard when the president declares an emergency, or a major disaster emergency in a specific area. That's what that means. And any additional areas that might be identified by the Department of Homeland Security. And the major disaster declarations and emergency declarations, they're all published in the Federal Register, and they're available at the link I provide you there. Next slide. So local area preference, like I had alluded to previously, when awarding emergency response contracts during the term of a major disaster or emergency declaration by the President under the authority of the Robert T. Stafford Disaster Relief and Emergency Act, preference shall be given to the extent feasible and practical to local firms. Preferences may be given through a local area set aside or an evaluation preference. So this does happen. There might be a local area set aside in a specific government budget where they want to encourage the government contracting officers and to be utilizing the local area vendors to help with the response of this emergency. And then here in B, when using the authority under the Stafford Act, there is a way for the authority to use an increased amount of the micro purchase threshold or simplified acquisition threshold. And so what this means is that if they need to use a local area firm, and to use those firms is higher, the cost of it's going to be higher than what would otherwise be deemed as the micro purchase threshold or the simplified acquisition threshold, the government can then do so. They can execute on that via an increased micro purchase threshold or simplified acquisition threshold. So that's really what that means. Next slide. So evaluation preference. The contracting officer may use an evaluation preference when authorizing an agency regulation or procedure. So they can evaluate evaluate all of the vendors that are available. They can evaluate who's available to respond to this emergency or this major disaster. They can use it at their own discretion. And then transition of work, and in anticipation of a potential emergency response, agencies involved in responding and planning should consider awarding emergency response contracts before a major disaster or emergency occurs to ensure immediate response and relief. So what does this mean exactly? How could we possibly know when something's happening? We tend to know. We can track when, say, a weather event is coming down the pike, a hurricane, for example. We're all watching the news, as is the federal government, including contracting officers, when something is going to happen. So essentially what this clause says is it's prudent on the part of the government to prepare and plan and line their ducks in a row to be able to award to emergency response contractors prior to the hurricane hitting the landfall of the various areas where I get hurricanes. Just for example, I'm just using hurricane as an example. But we have a tendency to know when things are about to happen, especially when it comes to weather events. So that's all it says, is that the government should be prudent and be prepared to award those emergency response contracts. Next slide. And some more about the transition of work. That essentially is saying that the 45 USC 5150B2 requires that agencies performing response, relief, and reconstruction activities transition to local firms any work performed under contracts in effect on that date which the President declares a major disaster or emergency, unless the head of that agency determines in writing that it's just not feasible or practical to transition that work to a local vendor. And this determination may be made on an individual contract or class basis, and written determinations shall be prepared within a reasonable time given the circumstances of the emergency. So essentially what this means is that if there's already work happening within the area and an emergency or major disaster occurs, then and the work is being performed by by companies that are not local firms, this is encouraging the government to then transition those contracts over to a local firm. to perform any disaster remediation or recovery efforts as feasible or practical. If it's not feasible or practical and the agency makes that determination, then it can stay with those firms that they're currently awarded with. Next slide. It's a lot to this transition of work clause. So again, affecting the transition, agencies aren't required to terminate or renegotiate existing contracts. They can keep them in place. Agencies should transition the work as early as possible, as practical, after considering the following: the potential duration of the disaster or emergency. If it's going to be a long remediation process, like we've seen some of the big hurricanes like Katrina, very long time to recover from that. The severity of the disaster or emergency, the scope and structure of the existing contract, including its period of performance and the milestones at which the transition is reasonable. A potential impact of a transition, including the safety, national defense, and mobilization, and expected availability of qualified local offers who can provide the products or services at a reasonable price. These are all things that the contracting officer needs to take into consideration when they're making their awards in response to a major disaster or an emergency situation. Next slide. So the agency shall transition the work to local firms as stated, using a local area set aside identified in FAR Part 26202-1. Again, I wanted to highlight the fact that preference shall be given to the extent feasible and practical to local firms. Next slide. Next slide. Okay, so FAR Part 26204, which is the justification for expenditures to other than local firms. So, say for example, there aren't local firms that can respond to a certain part of the disaster. So then the government has the ability to go outside of the search parameters to firms that are outside the local area. So 45 USC 5150B1 requires that subsequent to any presidential declaration of a major disaster emergency, any expenditures of federal funds under emergency response contract not awarded to a local firm must be justified in writing in the contract file. So for the contracting officer, they have to then justify why they're going outside of the local area to engage with a firm to respond to this major disaster or emergency. The justification should include consideration for the scope of the major disaster emergency and the immediate requirements or needs of supplies and services to ensure life is protected, victims are cared for, and property is protected. This is a very critical area of this FAR clause. And this whole FAR clause 26.2 is a very critical FAR clause in and of itself that gives governance over and direction over how the government must be responding to a major disaster or emergency. And then this justification may be made on an individual or class basis, so it doesn't have to be a whole broad brush of a justification, but that instead the contracting officer can use their discretion on a case-by-case basis to apply this justification. And then the contracting officer, of course, needs to approve the justification. Next slide. So the disaster response registry. So contracting officers shall constitute the disaster response registry on sam.gov to determine the availability of contractors for debris removal, distribution of supplies, reconstruction, and other disasters or emergencies. So if you work for a contractor and your firm does the type of work needed to help with remediation after a major disaster or an emergency assistance, you're going to want to register yourself, and there's a box you can check on sam.gov to be part of the disaster response registry. This is where the contracting officers are going to go to get their collection of contractors that can assist in the event of a major disaster or an emergency. And again, in B, as you can see, a list of those prospective vendors volunteering their abilities to participate in a disaster response will be on this registry and can be retrieved via SAM. Okay, next slide. So solicitation and provision contract clauses, again, this is a very common clause you'll see throughout the FAR in and of itself, but essentially it's giving guidance to the contracting officer to insert the provisions of 52226-3, disaster of emergency area representation in solicitations involving the local area set aside. For commercial products and commercial services, the FAR refers to 12301, which is a link there. And the contracting officer shall insert the clause of 52226-4, notice of disaster of emergency areas set aside in solicitations and contracts involving local area set-asides. So the government is requiring that there is notice given when a set-aside is being utilized. And then finally, the contracting officer shall insert the clause 52226-5, which is restrictions on subcontracting outside a disaster or emergency area, again, requiring contractors to work within that local area preference if and whenever practical and possible. And this needs to be included in all solicitations and contracts that involve local area set-asides. Next slide. All right, so let's talk a bit about historically Black colleges and universities and minority institutions, the subpart 26.3, which, as I previously mentioned, goes by the acronym of HBCU/MI. So with many of the other FAR clauses we've seen today, there's a scope. There was once something under 26301. It's now reserved. So, and that's what the government will do, so they don't have to renumber other clauses farther down. But maybe it was definitions. I'm not quite sure what it is, but it's no longer available. There's a general policy under section 26302, data collection and reporting requirements under 303, and the solicitation provision of when to apply this. Next slide. So the scope of this subpart. This subpart implements Executive Order 12928 of September 16th, 1994, which promotes the participation of historically Black colleges and universities, HBCUs, and minority institutions, MIs, in federal procurement. This subpart does not pertain to contracts performed entirely outside of the United States and its outlying areas. And I wanted to emphasize that it's really kind of CONUS contracts, the continental US contracts, that this particular subpart would apply to. Next slide. All right, so general policy. It's the policy of the government to promote participation of HBCUs and MIs in federal procurement, simply put, and you have a reference there to go review it at your leisure. Next slide. Okay, so data collection and reporting requirements, subpart 26.303, Executive Order 12928 also requires a periodic reporting to the President on the progress of departments and agencies in complying with the laws and requirements mentioned in the executive order. Now, this may also this may flow down to the contractor if you work for a contractor, and if you've ever had to do like small business plan reporting via what's called the ESRS, and you're encouraged to use, to identify which small business types you might be using, either a dollar or percentage that you're going to have a goal towards providing. That data then gets fed into this bigger report that then gets reported to the President. And then the solicitation provision, this particular FAR clause gives guidance on inserting the provision of 52226-2 in solicitations exceeding the micro purchase threshold for research, studies, supplies, and services of the type normally acquired from higher educational institutions. Next slide. All right, so this is the last of the FAR clauses for subpart 26, the food donations to nonprofit organizations. Just like the other ones, there's a scope, there's definitions, there's policies and procedures and contract clause as well with this subpart. Next slide. So the scope of the food donations to nonprofit organization, this implements the Federal Food Donation Act of 2008, which was codified in 42 U.S.C. 1792, and there's a link there for you if you're curious to go read it. There's a variety of definitions here, but the ones that I really want to point out for you is the apparently wholesome food means food that meets quality and labeling standards imposed by federal, state, and local laws and regulations, even though the food may not be readily marketable due to appearance, age, freshness, grade, size, surplus, or other conditions in accordance with B2 of the Bill Emerson Good Samaritan Food Donation Act. And there's a link there to the code where it describes that act. So excess food means food that's not required to meet the needs of the executive agencies, would otherwise be discarded. Food insecurity, another definition means inconsistent access to sufficient, safe, and nutritious food. Nonprofit organizations mean any organizations that are described in 501c of the IRS Code of 1986 and are exempt under Section 501A of that code. Next slide. Okay, so the policy for the food donations to nonprofit organizations, the government encourages executive agencies and their contractors to the maximum extent practicable and safe to donate excess, apparently wholesome food to nonprofit organizations that provide assistance to food insecure people in the U.S. And the procedure to do so is in accordance with the Food Donation Act of 2008. An executive agency shall comply with encouraging donations in applicable contracts stated in Section 26404, encouraging contractors to the maximum extent practicable and safe to donate apparently wholesome excess food to nonprofit organizations that provide assistance to food insecure people in the U.S. Next slide. And some more of the procedures, so the costs associated with this complying with this subpart 26.4. In any case in which a contractor enters into a contract with an executive agency under which apparently wholesome food is donated to food insecure people in the U.S., the head of the executive agency shall not assume responsibility for the costs and logistics of collecting, transporting, maintaining the safety of, or distributing excess apparently wholesome food to food insecure people in the U.S. under this act. So essentially, any contractor that does so, the government is not going to be held responsible for the costs of collecting and transporting and so on and so forth of that food. And the government will not reimburse any costs incurred by the contractor against this contract for any contract for the donation of federal excess foods. Any costs incurred for federal excess food donations are not considered allowable public relations costs in accordance with Section 31205-1 F8. Next slide. So liability, yeah, go back to the last slide. There you go. So let's talk a little bit real quickly about liability. So this is where the federal government is stating that they're not going to be held liable, or any contractor for that matter, in making donations pursuant to this act. The agency and the contractor will be exempt from civil and criminal liabilities to the extent provided under the Bill Emerson Good Samaritan Food Donation Act, and I've given you a reference in the USC where that is. But just to further explain it here in blue, the Bill Emerson Good Samaritan Food Donation Act requires states to adopt legislation to protect those who donate food in good faith from civil or criminal liability should such donated food later cause harm to recipients. It does not provide such protections in instances of gross negligence or intentional harm. Next slide. And then finally here, the contract clause. Essentially what this says, it gives guidance to the contracting officer to insert this clause 52-26-6, promoting excess food donation to nonprofit organizations in solicitations and contracts greater than $30,000 for the provision, service, or sale of food in the U.S. And there's a link for you to refer to it later. Next slide. And that's all I've got for you today under FAR Part 26. I hope this was very helpful to you. Feel free to email me should you have any questions about this presentation. I'm happy to answer any of those questions as you need. So thank you again for joining.
Thank you so much, Sandy, for a very informative presentation, and thanks to everybody who joined us today also. As mentioned, you can always catch the recordings on our YouTube channel within 24 hours and find over 600 webinars on government contracting there. And that's it for today, folks. Thank you again to Sandy, our speaker, and thanks to everybody who joined us. Have a wonderful Friday.